Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. You know those glossy photos you see on real estate apps? Well, today we are looking right past them to uncover the reality behind America's most troubled municipalities. We're going to unpack the illusion of the Zillow bargain, where cheap real estate often hides some pretty catastrophic systemic decay. I mean, it's incredibly tempting to see a heavily discounted home and think, wow, I found a hidden gem. But as the data from our source material shows, those incredibly low prices, they're almost always pricing in an invisible, very real cost. So let me ask you something. Would you buy a house for half price if the city literally didn't have a homicide unit? Sounds like a crazy exaggeration, right? But this is exactly what happened in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, Wilmington is the corporate capital of the nation. It's home to 65% of Fortune 500 companies. Yet, right down the street from all that paper wealth, the city at one point completely lacked a homicide unit, all while seeing a staggering 71% jump in murders in a single year. That disconnect between corporate wealth and street-level reality is just profound. It really forces us to ask, what are you actually buying into when you buy cheap? To really wrap our heads around this urban decay, we're going to organize the data into 5 core themes: the hidden price of cheap, when the people leave, cities built for yesterday, the price of survival, and finally, when every system fails. Part 1. The hidden price of cheap. We're unpacking the systemic costs of urban decay. Okay, so we need to define what's actually driving the danger in these places. It rarely happens overnight. It's this mechanical downward spiral that the source calls the flywheel effect. It works like this. When people who can afford to leave do so, the tax base shrinks. Less money means fewer resources for the city, which leads to degraded services, which then causes even more people to leave. Indianapolis is a perfect example. Right now, they're short 354 police officers. When you lack that much staff in a major city, response times stretch out, cases go cold, and the taxpayers who stuck around feel unsafe and decide to flee too. The flywheel just keeps spinning in the wrong direction, constantly accelerating the decline. Moving on to part 2, when the people leave. Let's look at the statistical link between population drain and rising crime. Look at these numbers from St. Louis. They really brilliantly illustrate this crisis. Since 1995, the city lost 22% of its residents. But because of that lost tax base, they lost an astonishing 40% of their police force. The math is just brutal here. The resources deplete so much faster than the population does. When a city shrinks by a fifth, but loses almost half of its public safety infrastructure, the remaining residents are forced to absorb a massive deficit in protection. This brings us to a really fantastic quote from the source material regarding Cleveland. They describe a shrinking city as a suit 2 sizes too big for the body wearing it. Cleveland has actually lost 60% of its population since 1950. As a result, it still has world-class cultural infrastructure, great hospitals, a major art museum, pro sports teams, but it's surrounded by empty neighborhoods. In some areas, there are literally more vacant lots than occupied houses. The city just doesn't have enough residents left to fill the suit. Part 3. Cities built for yesterday. Let's dive into the economic impact of infrastructure failure. So, the crucial question is, what happens to a city's physical environment when its economic purpose disappears? The source highlights Milwaukee, the most segregated metro area in America, to define what's called an architecture gap. And get this statistic. In Milwaukee, Black families making 6 figures are 35 times more likely to live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods than white households at the exact same income level. It's not just an income gap, it's the physical, structural design of a city engineered to trap people geographically, regardless of what they earn. The infrastructure itself is dictating the boundaries of prosperity. And what if that physical infrastructure actually poisons the people it's meant to serve? The cost is immeasurable. Check out this number, $400 million. That's the total spending so far on Flint, Michigan's water crisis, where lead pipes poison the water supply. But here's the critical takeaway from the source. Despite all that money and replacing the pipes, the government prosecuted almost nobody, just one minor conviction. It created a massive trust deficit. As activists pointed out, you can't just throw $400 million at pipes and expect people to drink the water when the trust is entirely broken. There is absolutely no infrastructure project that can repair that level of institutional failure. Gary, Indiana represents the ultimate infrastructure gap. It's an entire city built for yesterday. Gary was engineered around a single massive employer, U.S. Steel. Back at its peak, the plant had 30,000 workers. Today, that number is roughly 6,000. Because that main economic engine scaled back by 80%, the city saw a 62% population loss. Now, a third of all homes are abandoned, and 21 public schools have been closed. It's almost like a movie set where production is wrapped. The streets and infrastructure are still sitting there, built for nearly 180,000 people, but trying to serve just 67,000. Part 4. The Price of Survival. Let's look at some personal stories from residents in these cities. Pivoting from the macro statistics to the human toll, what's really alarming is how abnormal behavior just becomes entirely rational. Listen to this quote from a resident of Danville, Illinois, where crime is 3.5 times the state average. "I used to leave my car unlocked, hoping burglars wouldn't break the windows." Just think about that for a second. That isn't a security strategy. It's quite literally negotiating terms of surrender with your own neighborhood. You are voluntarily giving up your property just to save the cost of replacing the glass. And it gets even more severe in East St. Louis. Here's a resident's advice for survival. At night, run every stop sign and every traffic light with your doors locked. When breaking basic traffic laws becomes a required survival tip just to stay alive, the city isn't merely struggling anymore. It is the visible, daily evidence of a century of unfixed problems. But honestly, perhaps the most chilling quote comes from Baton Rouge. Dante, an 18-year-old resident there, captured his city's relationship with violence perfectly. He said, "It's Baton Rouge. It's the usual. It's not really something you should be afraid of. It's something you need to be prepared for." This just brilliantly illustrates the normalization of violence. When an 18-year-old calls murder the usual, it is arguably the most dangerous symptom we've seen on this entire list. It means the basic expectation of safety has completely vanished. Finally, Part 5, when every system fails, the ultimate convergence of collapse. So what happens when the population drain, the infrastructure failure, and the human suffering all hit a single municipality at exactly the same time? Well, consider the number 77.8. That is Jackson, Mississippi's 2024 homicide rate per 100,000 people. To put that into perspective, that gives Jackson the highest murder rate in America, and they've held that grim title for the 4th consecutive year. The safety system has completely, totally failed. But safety isn't the only thing collapsing. $2 billion. That is the estimated cost just to repair Jackson's water treatment system. Back in 2022, the system had a total collapse, leaving 150,000 residents without safe drinking water. So you've got the highest murder rate in the country, overlapping directly with a catastrophic failure of basic public utilities. These systemic roadblocks just compound the danger from every angle. You have the safety failure, the infrastructure failure, and an economic failure with a 26% poverty rate. Adding to all this is a severe governance failure. According to our source material, the state's Republican-controlled legislature has repeatedly blocked the 82% black city from raising its own sales tax to fund these desperate repairs. And just to be super clear here, we are not endorsing any political viewpoints or taking sides. We are simply and neutrally reporting the facts exactly as they appear in the source data. But the source highlights this friction point to show how local efforts to fix massive structural decay can be entirely paralyzed by higher-level legislative blocks. So I want you to imagine living through these specific steps every single day. You wake up, turn on the faucet, and the water is brown. You call the city, and they tell you there's no fix. You check the news, another homicide. Then, finally, you check Zillow, and you realize your house is worth less than your car. You're trapped in a municipality where nobody with power has the incentive or the means to fix it. Which brings us to this really sobering realization from the source. When you experience that daily routine, you aren't really living in a functioning city anymore. You are living in the evidence of what happens when every single system fails at once. These cities survive, sure, but they do so at a massive human and structural cost. A cost that most people absolutely do not price into their affordable mortgage when they're looking for a deal online. So we're going to leave you with a final question. The next time you see an affordable city with great potential, what questions will you ask? Before you chase the allure of cheap real estate, look at the population drain, study the infrastructure data, and look at the crime statistics. Ask yourself, what hidden price tag are you actually paying for that discount? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep asking.